Claire Donovan didn't buy her plane ticket with hope. She bought it with exhaustion. 2 months after her 10-year relationship imploded, and a week after quitting her unfulfilling job as an office manager in London, she sat on the floor of her apartment surrounded by half-packed boxes, a bottle of cheap wine in one hand, and an open laptop screen glaring at her with discounted flight deals. It was sometime after midnight when she clicked Confirm on a multi-country rail pass and a one-way ticket to Amsterdam, not knowing exactly what she was looking for, only that staying still meant suffocating. By the time she boarded her flight, the only plan she had was to avoid plans altogether. For the first week, her days blurred in a whirlwind of cobblestone streets, sketchbook doodles, and strong coffee in quiet corners. Amsterdam charmed her, but she found herself craving something less curated, less expected. She skipped over Berlin and Paris, opting instead to weave through Prague and then to Budapest, where a twist in her path would begin to form. Budapest was sticky with late summer heat, the kind that clung to skin and made the Danube shimmer with lazy elegance. She stayed in a modest hostel nestled between a bakery and an antique bookstore in District VII, a part of the city known for its art, its strangeness, and its honesty. Claire thrived among the chipped pastel buildings and underground ruined pubs, sketching faces in notebooks and collecting stories from strangers. It was in one of those ruined pubs, under flickering red lights and walls plastered with foreign stickers, that she first met him. His name was Felix, or so he claimed, and he spoke with a peculiar accent Claire couldn't place. He wore a weathered leather satchel, a crescent-shaped scar beneath his left eye, and carried a charm that felt like it had been sharpened through decades, not years. They shared a table during a spoken-word event, herself out of politeness, him seemingly out of calculation. Felix was the type to ask deeply personal questions without apology, and Claire, caught off guard, answered them. She told him about the breakup, about how she felt invisible even when someone swore they loved her. He didn't flinch or try to console her. Instead, he nodded like someone cataloging her words, storing them somewhere significant. Sometimes, he said, a person has to be completely lost before they can be truly found. It was the kind of vague wisdom Claire might have dismissed from anyone else, but from Felix it felt like a challenge. They parted ways after just one drink, and Claire chalked the encounter up to a strange but harmless travel footnote. But the next morning, she found something that would make her rethink that night entirely. Tucked between the pages of her sketchbook, which she'd left on her hostel bed, was a dried blue cornflower, a national symbol of Hungary, and a folded note written in perfect English. The handwriting was neat, almost ceremonial. When the path becomes unclear, step off it. The forest waits. No signature, no explanation, just that. Claire looked around her bunk suspiciously, but no one was paying her any attention. She could have ignored it. She should have. But the message felt like a tether to something, perhaps to a version of herself she hadn't met yet. For a few days, she tried to brush it off, visiting thermal baths and hiking up to Buda Castle, but the note haunted her. Felt like the beginning of something. She couldn't tell if it was curiosity or recklessness guiding her, but she began walking different streets, visiting corners of the city she hadn't planned to see, half hoping she'd run into Felix again, half fearing she actually would. On her 4th night in Budapest, Claire took a tram out to the city's edge, where the urban sprawl gave way to the beginnings of wilderness. It wasn't completely spontaneous. She'd seen a flyer at the hostel for a folk music gathering hosted in a nearby village and thought it might provide some clarity or, at the very least, a distraction. But when she arrived, she found no festival, no music, just silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog. There were no signs, no locals, just an overwhelming stillness that seemed to seep into her bones. A young woman in a yellow scarf approached her wordlessly, handed her a small envelope, and walked away before Claire could speak. Inside the envelope was another note, written in the same careful handwriting. If you want to begin again, come to Magura. Ask for the candlemaker. Below it was a set of coordinates scribbled in ink that bled slightly through the thin paper. Claire spent the entire tram ride back gripping the envelope tightly. She hadn't even heard of Magura. Google revealed it was a tiny Romanian village nestled in the Carpathians, a place known for hiking and legends, but not much else. Her rational mind screamed that this was ridiculous, dangerous even, but deep down, there was a hunger in her. Not for danger, but for transformation. For something that would yank her out of the quiet spiral of her life. She booked the next train toward Romania that night. The map of her journey was changing, no longer dictated by guidebooks or blogs, but by cryptic notes, strangers, and the call of something hidden. She didn't know it yet, but her journey through Europe was no longer a backpacking trip. It was an initiation. And once she crossed into those forested hills, there would be no easy way back. The train to Romania cut through the landscape like a silver blade, and Claire spent most of the journey staring at the blur of green hills and scattered villages beyond the glass, clutching the envelope like it was a map to another life. She had tried to tell herself she was just being adventurous, indulging in a little mystery before returning to the ordinary world. But she knew better. Something in her had shifted, something that craved not just escape but transformation. She arrived in Brasov under a sky veiled in dark clouds, the station quiet except for the occasional echo of luggage wheels and distant barking. Using the coordinates on the note, she plotted a course to Magura, a remote mountain village tucked deep within the Piatra Craiului National Park. There were no direct buses, so she arranged for a rideshare with a local woman named Daciana, who agreed to take her as far as Zarnesti, the nearest town with roads that hadn't surrendered completely to the forest. The drive was silent but heavy with unspoken tension. Daciana barely spoke except to warn Claire about wolves and tell her that Magura was not for tourists. When Claire asked about the candlemaker, Daciana's eyes flicked toward her like a reflex, and then she stared back at the road as if she'd never heard the question. It wasn't until they reached a crumbling edge of town that Daciana finally pulled over and gestured toward a narrow path that disappeared into the woods. "You walk from here," she said simply. "Don't speak to anyone until you find the fire." Claire tried to ask what she meant, but Daciana slammed the car door and drove off, leaving her with a backpack, a worn map, and a growing sense of unreality. The air in the forest felt ancient, as though the trees were older than memory itself. Moss clung to rocks like velvet, and every branch creaked like it was whispering something Claire wasn't meant to understand. She walked for hours, her phone's signal gone and her GPS frozen on a single, mocking blue dot. By the time she stumbled into Magura, dusk was bleeding across the sky, casting the village in deep purples and muted golds. The houses were sparse and weathered, built from stone and wood that looked as though it had been harvested by hand centuries ago. Smoke curled from chimneys. Sheep bleated from some unseen field. The silence here was not empty. It was dense, watchful. Claire asked a bent old man passing by if he knew the candlemaker, but he only spat at the ground and shuffled past her. Children peeked from behind doorways but darted away when she approached. Finally, as night fell and the cold crept into her jacket, she saw a faint glow coming from a structure half swallowed by trees on the village's edge. The building was unlike the others, circular, built from dark stone with stained glass windows that flickered from candlelight within. A wooden sign above the door read simply, "Luminari." Claire knocked once, twice, and just as she turned to leave, the door opened. A woman in her 60s, with long silver hair and eyes like polished glass, stood in the doorway. "You're late," the woman said, then stepped aside to let her in. The interior smelled of beeswax, lavender, and something metallic. Candles in every size and color lined the shelves, melted into shapes that resembled twisted spines and warped faces. The woman introduced herself as Serena and poured Claire a steaming cup of herbal tea before asking where she got the invitation. Claire, unsure how much to reveal, said only that it had found her. Serena gave a slight smile, as if she already knew, and handed Claire a third and final note. This one stamped with a red wax seal bearing a symbol of 3 interlocking circles. "You've been chosen," it read. "The rite begins in 3 days. Come prepared. Tell no one." Beneath the message were instructions for a rendezvous point in the mountains, followed by the phrase, "Only those ready to shed the skin of their former selves may enter." Claire stared at the paper, her hands trembling slightly. She asked Serena what kind of rite it was, but the woman only said, "You'll understand when it's time." before retreating into the back room and closing the door behind her. That night, Claire stayed in an old guest house where no one spoke to her. Not even the innkeeper who slid her key across the counter with downcast eyes. Sleep came in fragments, and her dreams were filled with chanting voices and faceless figures standing in circles of flame. The next day, she explored Megura, finding the village eerily quiet despite the signs of life. No one greeted her. No one answered her questions. It was as though she had stepped out of the modern world entirely and into a forgotten one. A place where time was warped and rules were whispered, not spoken. She tried to sketch the village, but her hands shook too much, and every drawing turned out warped. The air smelled different here, thicker, like incense clinging to fog. On her final evening before the ceremony, she walked back to Luminari, only to find the doors barred and the windows dark. A bundle of herbs wrapped in red thread had been left on the doorstep with her name etched into the paper tag. She took it and retreated to her room, rereading the note and trying to steady her breathing. That night, as she packed her belongings, she caught her reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes looked wider, her posture more guarded. There was something inside her now. A pulse of excitement, yes, but also an ancient unease. Claire wasn't sure whether she was being lured or liberated, but the pull was irresistible. As the sun set on her final day in the village, she wrapped the red-threaded herbs around her wrist, folded the invitation into the lining of her backpack, and took one last look at the quiet village of Megura. The forest awaited, and whatever lay beyond it, she was now a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. The morning of the ceremony began not with an alarm but with an instinctive jolt. Claire woke before the first light reached her window, heart racing as if summoned by something beyond the realm of sound. The village was shrouded in mist, and even the roosters were silent. She dressed in layered clothes and sturdy boots, unsure what conditions the mountain trail would throw at her. The note had instructed her to follow the trail marked with red stones and not to deviate, no matter what. At the edge of Megura, she found the path, a barely visible dirt line stretching into the forest, the first stone gleaming faintly red in the dew-soaked grass. With her pack strapped tightly and the red-threaded herbs still wrapped around her wrist, she stepped into the woods, the village dissolving behind her like a fading dream. The deeper she walked, the quieter the world became. The sounds of civilization evaporated, replaced by an eerie symphony of rustling branches, dripping leaves, and the occasional distant snap of something unseen. Time became elastic in the forest, every minute feeling both stretched and compressed. The canopy grew denser, blocking the sky until it felt like dusk even though it was barely mid-morning. Claire passed small markers carved into tree trunks, symbols similar to the ones on the invitation's wax seal, each one reaffirming that she was still on the intended path. Yet there was a slow but unmistakable shift in the air. It no longer felt like she was alone. Footsteps, always just a second behind her own, came and went with the wind. A shadow darted across her periphery, and when she spun around, there was nothing but trees and mist. At one point, she thought she heard her name whispered, not shouted or spoken, but exhaled, as if the forest itself was breathing her presence. After several hours of climbing, the trail opened onto a high clearing, and for the first time, Claire saw the full stretch of the mountains. The horizon was jagged and breathless, a sea of green peaks veiled in clouds. Nestled within the clearing was a large circular structure made of dark stone and thick timber beams, half covered in moss and partially buried in the hillside. Around it stood a series of small, tent-like lodgings, each one spaced evenly like spokes on a wheel. Claire had barely stepped into the clearing when a young man with shaved hair and a pale tunic approached her silently, extended his hand, and gently took her backpack. He didn't speak, only gestured for her to follow him to one of the small dwellings. Inside, the space was sparse. A mat, a clay bowl of water, and a folded set of off-white robes laid atop a wooden chest. A note rested on the robes. "Cleanse yourself. Speak no words until summoned." For the remainder of the day, Claire stayed in her lodge, unsure if she was being watched or if the forest stillness was simply amplifying her paranoia. She changed into the robes and washed her face in the bowl, the water cold enough to sting. When night fell, she was startled by a low, humming sound that rose slowly in the air, not from any one direction but from all around. She peeked outside and saw other participants, men and women, all robed in identical fabric, emerging from their huts and walking barefoot toward the central stone structure. The air thrummed with energy, like something sacred and electric was about to unfold. Claire followed, heart hammering beneath her thin robe, her breath clouding in the sudden chill. As she approached, the door of the central structure creaked open seemingly on its own, revealing flickering candlelight within and a thick, aromatic smoke that hit her like a wave. Inside, the room was circular, with concentric rings carved into the stone floor. The attendees formed a perfect circle along the outer ring, each taking a seat cross-legged and silent. At the center was a massive iron bowl filled with smoldering embers, casting an otherworldly glow on the walls. Strange symbols were etched into the stones, some glowing faintly as if lit from within. The humming grew louder, layered with rhythmic breathing and what sounded like low chanting in a language Claire had never heard. Then a figure entered from the shadows, hooded, tall, draped in black robes unlike the pale ones worn by the others. His face was obscured, but his presence filled the room with a crushing gravity. He raised his arms, and the room fell completely silent. One by one, the robed attendees placed objects into the burning bowl: hair, teeth, torn pages, and small cloth bundles, each accompanied by a silent bow. When it came to Claire's turn, she froze. She had brought nothing, but as she stood, the hooded man extended his hand, and she instinctively offered the red-threaded herb bundle still tied to her wrist. He took it without comment, dropped it into the flame, and the fire roared suddenly, the red threads sparking like fireworks. That night, back in her hut, Claire couldn't sleep. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from an unfamiliar cocktail of fear and fascination. She had thought this would be some experimental spiritual retreat, maybe even an eccentric wellness cult, but what she had witnessed felt far older, far more deliberate. She began to piece things together, the symbols matching those from Serina's candle shop, the whispered stories of lost hikers, the way everyone seemed hollow yet devout. This wasn't just ritual, it was control. And as she stared at the ceiling, Claire realized something chilling. No one had asked for her name, her identification, or even her consent. They didn't care who she had been. They were only interested in what she would become. The forest never truly slept, but that night, it held its breath. Claire was roused from a shallow, feverish rest by the low tolling of a bell, dull and distant, yet resonant enough to make her chest vibrate. She sat up, her hut cloaked in darkness save for the pale gleam of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wood. Outside, a procession had already begun. Figures in bone-white robes emerged from their lodgings and moved silently toward the main stone structure, their faces obscured by delicate wooden masks painted with intricate, curling black symbols. There were no words, no instructions, just that same primal pull she'd felt since entering the forest. When she stepped outside, she found a mask resting on the stone steps. Its surface was smoother than the others, the designs less aggressive, almost fluid. She hesitated, then tied it around her face, and joined the flow of bodies threading through the mist like a single organism. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the only warmth came from the torches held aloft by silent sentinels standing at fixed points along the path. The air was thick with incense, bitter, almost metallic, and it stung Claire's nostrils as she breathed. She kept her eyes forward, her steps synchronized with the others, trying not to be the one who broke the rhythm. The stone building loomed ahead, its upper edge barely visible beneath the black sky. But tonight they didn't enter. Instead, they passed it, winding further into the trees, following a narrow trail that hadn't existed earlier that day. Roots clawed at her ankles and branches reached for her hair, but the group never slowed. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest transformed. Symbols began to appear carved into trees, some fresh, some ancient. Animal skulls dangled from branches wrapped in red twine, their hollow eye sockets swaying gently in the night breeze. Claire began to feel a pressure behind her eyes, a sensation like her body was shrinking inside itself, as if the very air demanded something from her. After what felt like an hour, the procession spilled into a vast clearing illuminated only by moonlight and fire pits that ringed the space like glowing sentinels. At the center stood a tall stone altar, jagged and dark with age, its surface stained and cracked. Surrounding it were robed figures who hadn't walked with them, elders perhaps or higher initiates. They wore masks adorned with antlers, feathers, and gold thread. At the base of the altar knelt a woman, draped in sheer cloth, her hands bound gently with braided vine. Her face was visible, and even from a distance, Claire could see the strange calm in her eyes. She didn't look drugged or afraid. She looked resolved, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment. A circle formed around the scene, every attendee taking their place with choreographed precision. Claire felt herself drawn into the current, standing shoulder to shoulder with the others, her heartbeat a drum in her ears. The hooded leader, the same one from the earlier ritual, appeared from the shadows, holding a staff carved with symbols that shimmered faintly. He approached the altar with slow, deliberate steps, raised the staff, and the entire clearing fell into silence so profound it made Claire's ears ring. Then the chanting began. Low, guttural, rhythmic. Words that didn't belong to any language she knew but pulsed with a familiarity that rattled her bones. Claire found herself mouthing the syllables despite not knowing them, the cadence infecting her like a fever. The masked leader circled the kneeling woman, placing tokens on her shoulders, dried flowers, bones, silver coins. Each item was met with a different tone from the gathering, a synchronized hum or click of tongues, as though the meaning of each offering was deeply encoded. Then came the silence again. The leader removed his hood, revealing a face that was neither young nor old, with skin so pale it looked powdered, and eyes that burned a deep, unnatural amber. His gaze passed over the group, lingering on Claire just a second too long. Her stomach turned to ice. Without a word, he raised the staff high and drove it into the ground beside the altar, causing a shudder that vibrated through the clearing. The bound woman lowered her head, as if submitting to something larger than herself, and from behind the altar, a second figure emerged. Taller, shrouded entirely in black, face hidden beneath a veil of threads. Claire instinctively took a step back, but those beside her held firm. No one moved. No one even blinked. The veiled figure placed a hand on the kneeling woman's head, and the flames around the clearing surged upward with a violent hiss. The sound that followed was not human. It was a high, keening wail that seemed to come from the earth itself. Claire's mask felt suffocating now, her breath catching in her throat as the ceremony intensified. The woman was lifted, not by hands, but as if gravity itself had reversed, and she hovered briefly before collapsing gently to the ground, motionless. No blood, no cries, just stillness. The veiled figure receded into the woods, the staff was retrieved, and the leader turned back toward the circle. One by one, the attendees bowed, pressing their foreheads to the earth, but Claire stayed upright, her legs locked in shock. The leader tilted his head, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging her defiance or recognizing it. Then he spoke for the first time, his voice like dry leaves scraping stone. The old is shed, the vessel is filled, the forest remembers. The crowd repeated the words in unison, and Claire, caught in the gravity of their chant, whispered them too. As the ceremony ended, the group dispersed without discussion, returning to the path in the same silent procession. Claire's limbs moved, but her mind struggled to process what she had witnessed. Was it death or transformation? Was the woman sacrificed or saved? Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run, but something deeper whispered that it was already too late, that whatever this was, she was now bound to it. As they re-entered the forest trail, the masks were removed and left hanging on the trees. Claire hesitated, then left hers behind, the wood damp with sweat. Back in her hut, she vomited into the corner bowl, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She knew now that this wasn't some eccentric rite or spiritual detox. This was something far older, more organized, and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And worse still, she wasn't sure if she wanted out, or if something inside her wanted to go even deeper. The morning after the ceremony brought no clarity, only a suffocating heaviness that clung to Claire's skin like damp linen. The sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy above, casting speckled shadows across the compound, but nothing about the place felt lighter. Every smile from the other initiates now seemed hollow, their eyes glazed with the kind of devotion that bordered on vacancy. She tried to ask questions, but no one responded, not even with body language. Just eerie, calm silence as though their minds were locked behind an invisible gate. Meals were served communally in the central clearing, yet there was no speaking, only the mechanical act of chewing, sipping, and returning to solitude. Claire felt eyes on her constantly, yet when she turned to catch them, everyone's gaze was elsewhere. She realized that whether by design or manipulation, her presence now marked her as someone different. Not chosen, not sacred, just watched. That afternoon, she snuck away from the group meditation gathering and ventured toward the edge of the encampment, pretending to collect herbs. Beyond the final tent, nestled against a slope shaded by elder pines, she spotted a narrow footpath, partially overgrown. She stepped onto it cautiously, heart thudding, and followed it for several minutes before coming upon a small spring. There, crouched by the water's edge, was a woman she hadn't seen before, older, dressed in layers of natural fiber, and barefoot. Her hands were weathered, nails rimmed with soil, and her hair braided with dried lavender. She looked up and said Claire's name before Claire had even opened her mouth. "I was you once," the woman whispered, "before I understood what they really are." Claire froze, unsure whether this was another trick, another test. But the woman spoke quickly and quietly, eyes darting toward the trees as if they, too, had ears. Her name was Ines, and she had arrived at the retreat 3 years ago. But she had never left. Not because she couldn't, she clarified, but because each time she tried, someone would stop her. Not overtly, not violently, but through a chain of subtle manipulations. Her belongings gone missing, paths rearranged, people guiding her back with warm smiles and gentle redirection, until she began to question whether escape was even worth the trouble. What frightened her most, she said, was that over time, she stopped wanting to leave. "They feed you just enough peace," she explained, "to make you forget the prison around it." Claire asked why she hadn't warned anyone else, but Ines simply replied, "Most don't want to hear it. They come here broken and leave hollow. Or they never leave at all." But there was still a way out, an old trail used by forest workers before the retreat claimed the land. It was dangerous, rarely used, and easy to miss, but it led to a ranger's hut beyond the northern ridge. Ines couldn't guide her directly. They would notice, but she drew a crude map on the back of a cloth scrap and wrapped it in a bundle of herbs. That night, Claire returned to her hut and pretended to sleep until well past midnight. The forest seemed to hum with anticipation, as though sensing her intention. She packed light: the map, a water flask, and a small utility knife she'd kept hidden in her boot since Budapest. Before stepping outside, she removed her ceremonial robe and buried it beneath her bedding, replacing it with a plain tunic she'd taken from a laundry pile. The minute she slipped into the woods, every instinct in her screamed. Every crackle of leaves, every chirp of nocturnal insects felt amplified. The trail was nearly invisible in the dark, and twice she almost veered off course before spotting the faint markers Ines had described. A tree with a scarred trunk, a moss-covered boulder shaped like a skull. Her breath came in short bursts, but she forced her legs to keep moving, muscles burning with each incline. Hours passed. The darkness pressed against her like a living thing, and fear began to fray the edges of her focus. Was she being followed? Were those footsteps hers, or someone else's just behind? At one point, she heard the distant call of a flute, soft, haunting, and unmistakably from the compound. It was their signal. They knew someone had broken the circle. Panic surged through her veins like venom, and she broke into a full sprint, ignoring the thorns clawing her legs and branches slapping her face. Her lungs screamed for air, and still she ran, guided now more by desperation than memory. Then, out of the blackness, a hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. She gasped, twisted violently, and prepared to stab, only to see Ines. The older woman looked wild, her braid frayed, her chest heaving. "Go," she hissed. "Don't look back. No matter what you hear, no matter what you feel." Claire nodded, too shaken to speak, and tore through the underbrush, finally emerging onto a narrow trail that opened into a rocky descent. Down the slope, just visible in the breaking dawn, was a wooden structure, tilted, overgrown but real. She stumbled toward it, nearly falling twice, until she reached the door and collapsed against it, pounding frantically. A man inside, weathered, with a rifle slung over his back, opened it cautiously. His eyes widened when he saw her. Claire tried to explain, but the words came out as sobs. The man ushered her in, locked the door, and gave her water. She couldn't stop shaking. She'd made it. But in that moment, sitting on a dirt-streaked floor in a forgotten ranger's hut, she knew something terrifying. She hadn't just escaped a cult. She had crossed a threshold and left a part of herself behind in those woods that might never come back. The days that followed were a haze of fluorescent lights, antiseptic smells, and soft murmurs spoken just out of reach. Claire awoke in a Romanian hospital bed with bruises on her arms and scratches lining her calves. The remnants of her harrowing escape through the forest still mapped across her skin. Doctors poked and prodded with clinical detachment, their questions growing sharper when her answers turned vague. They found no identification, only a water-stained cloth bundle with a strange, herbal scent and a torn map with unintelligible markings. A translator was brought in to bridge the language gap, but Claire struggled to explain what had happened without sounding delusional. She spoke of rituals, masked figures, a woman who floated in midair, and a cult hidden in the Carpathians. But all it earned her were skeptical glances and muttered references to exhaustion, trauma, and hallucinations induced by dehydration. No one believed her. The authorities filed a report, noted her escape as a possible case of psychological distress exacerbated by isolation, and gently suggested psychiatric evaluation. The ranger who had taken her in offered a terse statement but claimed he hadn't seen the compound Claire described, only a lost foreigner in shock. After 2 days of observation, she was released into the care of the British Embassy, her story sanitized and repackaged for bureaucratic digestion. A hiking trip gone wrong. A brush with altitude sickness and disorientation. Her passport was reissued, and arrangements were made for her return to the UK. But Claire couldn't go back, not really. She boarded the flight with her body intact but her mind fractured, replaying the ceremony, the chanting, the woman's serene surrender. The world outside hadn't changed, but she had, and it showed in the smallest ways. In the way she avoided reflections, in the nightmares that returned each night with clockwork precision, in the way she found herself sketching unfamiliar symbols in the corners of napkins and notebooks without realizing. Weeks passed, then months. She moved into a quiet flat in East London, withdrew from her friends, and abandoned social media. Her once vibrant art turned muted and geometric, filled with sharp edges and symmetrical patterns she couldn't explain. The only thing she kept from her journey, aside from the memories, was the scrap of cloth Ines had given her. Tucked inside it were 2 things she hadn't noticed before. A silver pendant etched with the same interlocking circles from the invitation, and a small note in spidery handwriting that read, "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." That line haunted her more than anything she'd seen in the forest. She began to dig, not publicly, but with quiet obsession. She combed through obscure forums, Reddit threads, and untranslated articles about rural Romanian folklore and missing backpackers. What she found was fragmented but consistent. Whispers of ancient forest rites, of people disappearing without trace, of strange symbols appearing on old churches and cave walls. The more she looked, the more she saw the patterns repeated across Europe, in the Black Forest of Germany, the fjords of Norway, the Pyrenees in Spain. A network, not a cult with a name and a manifesto, but something older, more elusive, embedded in the forgotten corners of modern civilization. One day, while organizing her travel photos, Claire zoomed in on an image she'd taken in Budapest, days before the invitation appeared. In the background, partially obscured by shadows, was Felix, the man from the ruined pub. He wasn't looking at the camera but at her. His eyes, even in low resolution, bore the same hypnotic sharpness as the hooded figure who had led the ceremony. She scanned through other photos. He appeared again, outside a market in Prague, near a bridge in Krakow, always distant, always watching. Her stomach turned to stone. This hadn't started in Magura. It had started before she ever left London. The journey had only made her visible to them. It wasn't random. She had been chosen, observed, maybe even marked. And if Felix had followed her then, who was to say he or others like him weren't still watching now? Unable to ignore the signs, Claire reached out to a small investigative podcast known for diving into fringe theories and modern myths. She didn't reveal everything at first, just breadcrumbs. The invitation, the ceremony, the disappearance of Ines. The hosts were intrigued but cautious, until Claire shared the pendant and its markings. One of them recognized the symbol, not from Romania, but from a series of recovered manuscripts in northern Italy, tied to a pre-Christian sect that worshipped the echo in the woods, an entity believed to inhabit the silence between human thought. The similarities were too close to dismiss. The team offered to travel with her back to Magura to document everything. Claire hesitated but agreed, driven by a need for proof, not just for others but for herself. They returned in early spring. Magura, when they arrived, was not how she remembered it. The village was nearly abandoned. Doors hung open on creaking hinges. Chimneys were cold. The once watchful eyes of the locals were gone. It was as if the entire place had been erased. Luminari, the candle house, was reduced to a pile of blackened stones, as if burned long ago. The central trail into the woods was overgrown, impassable without tools. But the symbols remained, barely visible beneath moss, carved into trees, etched into rocks. Her memories weren't wrong. Something had been there. The team documented everything, collected soil samples, used drones to scan the area for unusual structures. But what they found wasn't conclusive. The stone altar clearing, which had once pulsed with unholy energy, was now empty. No bones, no ruins, just a depression in the earth too symmetrical to be natural. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Back in London, the podcast aired Claire's story in 3 parts. It went viral. Listeners were divided. Some accused her of fabrication. Others sent in similar stories, fragments of experiences that echoed her own. One message stood out. An email from a woman in Austria who claimed she had also escaped a retreat in the mountains and had seen Claire's sketch of the veiled figure before. In her dreams, the correspondence opened a floodgate. Claire began receiving more messages from people with missing time, strange scars, and recurring dreams of chanting and fire. The cult wasn't a cult. It was a current, subterranean, ancient, and still alive. Claire no longer sought closure. She sought understanding. She knew that running hadn't saved her. It had only postponed whatever had started the moment she stepped off the beaten path in Budapest. Her life now existed in the spaces between sleep and waking, between sanity and doubt. But one truth remained unshakable. Once the forest sees you, it never forgets.